Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Freemasonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. I'm your host, Brother Robert Johnson. This is episode 155. Well, the news for this week, kind of some fun stuff. We, at the Masonic Roundtable, were invited by Brother Nick Johnson of the millennialfreemason.com to take part in a meeting for an internet lodge. It was an amazing experience, I am told. I actually wasn't available to attend the meeting, but it was a tiled meeting on an internet web forum, and we're actually going to be talking about it live on Tuesday night, so in 3 nights on the Masonic Roundtable videocast or podcast, whichever platform you'll be listening or watching on. And the idea is the 5 of us will discuss the Internet Lodge experience. I am a non-participant, so I'll be asking the guys a lot of candid questions, things that are just on my mind about it. It'll be kind of a no-holds-bar thing. I'm just going to go to town and ask them all kinds of questions and give them the 3rd degree. No pun intended. So with that, we're going to get right into this week's first piece, which is a short talk bulletin about the 4 chaplains. And if you are a member of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction, you may be familiar with a few of these chaplains. There is a degree that deals with them. This comes from a Short Talk Bulletin, Volume 70, from February of 1992, and it's number 2, put out again by the Masonic Service Association of the United States. George L. Fox, from a Short Talk Bulletin honoring the 4 heroic chaplains. The Masonic Services Association is deeply appreciative of the work done by Wyatt Fox in preparing the following short talk bulletin on the life of his father, George L. Fox, one of the 4 immortal chaplains. Brother George Fox was a member of Moose River Lodge number 82 in Concord, Vermont. A plaque in his memory hangs in the lodge. Editor's note. Brother George L. Fox by Wyatt R. Fox. It was snowing gently across the entire Susquehanna watershed that morning of 15th March 1900. Probably it was not much concern to George L. Fox, as he was born in Lewistown, PA. Early on that day, his parents soon moved the family to Altoona, where the father could find better employment in the large switching yards of the several railroads that passed through the city. This was soon to be short-lived, for he was in an accident coupling 2 freight cars, when the train lurched and he was crushed. As a result, he lost a leg and had to use an artificial limb. By now, George had 2 younger brothers and a sister, along with his older brother. Childhood was more work than play, as they all had to help with family finances as they grew older. In spite of this, George managed to go to high school and graduate at age 16. After graduation from high school, George worked as a shipping clerk for the Altoona Manufacturing Company for a year. He watched the war clouds over Europe with increasing concern, so it was with great interest that he followed President Wilson's request to the full Congress on April 2nd, 1917 for a declaration of war against the Central Powers. George enlisted in the Army on the 12th of May. There was some concern about a birth certificate and his age, but he had graduated from high school and he had worked for a year, so he was accepted as older than his 17 years, and he was soon on his way to El Paso, Texas, and recruit training. After basic training, he was assigned to an ambulance company number 1 and began a training program in ambulance driving and learning to operate a new motorcycle for courier operations and battlefield first aid. American units were being rushed to France that summer to bolster the sagging Allied morale, and by fall, George's ambulance company was on the way to France to join the 2nd U.S. Army Division being formed over there. The men were hastily loaded into boxcars and trucks and rushed toward Paris. Near Paris, the way was clogged with departing French civilians and discouraged French soldiers. The division was ordered to form and hold a line from southwest to northwest of Chateau Thierry. There, the division received its first taste of real combat. 1/2 of the division were comprised of U.S. Marines, the only Marine infantry unit in France. These men were ordered into a stretch of dense forest that had been an old hunting preserve. It was crisscrossed by ravines and covered by large boulders. The Marines approached in formation across the new waist-high wheat field interspersed with blooming red-orange poppies. The enemy machine guns had been set up to fire down the rows of men as they passed. The withering fire decimated each row as they passed. The aid men tried to reach the fallen, but were taken down by the fire themselves and had to wait until nightfall to reach and retrieve the wounded. The battle went on for over 20 days to clear the woods. George reported he once had to carry the wounded back 4 miles through a shallow ravine to the first aid station in stone culvert under the road. Bodies lined the way, and one could not avoid stepping on them. After a rest, the division was sent into the line east of the city toll. This was a relatively quiet sector, but every day there were casualties. Here George was wounded by mustard gas. In September, the offense started with the American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF, moving up over a 40-mile front. George was gassed again at the front of the initial attack. In just a few days, the front line was straightened out from Metz to west of Verdun, and the 2nd Division was withdrawn back to the old French barracks on the Moselle River, west of Nancy. As usual, the rest period was not long, for at the end of September the division was called on again as shock troops. They were entrained and moved to an old French camp just south of Suippes. Blanc-Mont Ridge lay just north of Somme, a short distance north of their encampment. This ridge had been dug in and fortified for years south of the Hindenburg Line, the main German lines of fortifications. The shock troops were called upon again to take this position and to move north. The battle was fierce and lasted 9 days. George won the Silver Star there for taking off his gas mask in a gas attack, putting it on a wounded American officer, and while under fire bringing him into the aid station. After the war, memories mulled away at him. In France, he had been called, quote-unquote, the Little Minister, for he often settled arguments regarding religion. Finally, in 1923, he decided to act and went to Chicago and enrolled in the Moody Bible Institute to study for missionary work. George decided he had a call to preach, so he got in touch with the district superintendent of the Methodist Church, which covered northern Vermont. He enjoyed the long valleys and hills of Vermont, which reminded him of his early home in Pennsylvania. The rural churches, even then, were having a hard time surviving, so he had no trouble being placed as a licensed probationer in the Berkshire villages near the Canadian border. At a point in between, he also joined the Masonic fraternity in Concord, Vermont. When that infamous Sunday came around, we were sitting at the table eating supper. The news flash of the surprise attack came over the airwaves. George struck his fists together and said, "Now we'll go after them." George went to Fort Ethan Allen, near Burlington, and passed his physical. Then he was ordered to the first class of the new Army Chaplain School of Harvard University on the 3rd of August, 1942. While there, he met Chaplain Rabbi Good, and they became fast friends. 1 month later, George was ordered to Camp Davis in North Carolina and the 411th Coast Artillery BN. Shortly after his arrival, George put in for a transfer overseas where he thought his World War I experience would be more useful to the young soldiers going into combat for the first time. 9 weeks later, his orders came through for Camp Miles Standish, a replacement depot in eastern Massachusetts. They drove to Massachusetts, where he left his wife and daughter with her sister in Chicopee Falls. George was at Taunton just a couple of days when his friends from the Harvard class checked in. They were soon holding services together and working with the new transfers. In a few days, 2 more chaplains arrived to join them, Chaplains Pauling and Washington. In January, Uncle Bill Morrison had written to his Masonic friends in Taunton, where Camp Miles Standish is located. The gentleman came to the base and looked Dad up and invited him and a guest to his home for Sunday dinner. George and another officer went the following Sunday. I think it was quite fitting that his last meal in a civilian home was with his Masonic brothers. By the next Sunday, the 4 chaplains and a detachment from Camp Miles Standish were finally on a train for the trip to the embarkment port on Staten Island and their appointment with the USAT Dorchester. On February 3, 1943, off the coast of Newfoundland, a torpedo struck the Dorchester, and the order to abandon ship was given. The main life vest locker was on the main deck under the bridge. The 4 chaplains were there passing out preservers and assisting the men in getting them on. Then they insisted that the men get over the side and swim away from the ship. Finally, 4 men came up to the chaplains with no life preservers. The lockers were now empty. Without hesitation, the 4 chaplains removed their jackets and placed them on the men and ordered them over the side. The ship was now tilted and away to the starboard rail. The 4 chaplains now began to sing and to offer prayers for the safety of the men in the water. The ship rolled gently to starboard, and all was gone. A note that repeated searches have been made for the men that received the chaplain's life preservers, but it has been concluded that they were lost along with most of the men in the water. By far, the majority of the survivors came from the lifeboats and life rafts. In discussion with some of the survivors, we concluded that where they had to swim through the oil from the ruptured fuel tanks as they moved away from the ship, this provided just enough insulation coating to enable them to survive. So there you have it, a quite interesting look at one of the 4 chaplains. That is an interesting story that is always told within the fraternity, and especially in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. So now I need to talk about the ways to support the show. We support the shows 3 main ways: through our app sales, through PayPal, and through your shopping. So within the app sales, what is the app? Well, what we do is we have an app for this show which lets you listen to your favorite episodes, mark your favorite episodes. You can listen to them streaming rather than downloading them on an iPod. But what's very special about our app is that you get bonus features. So these are like extras on a DVD. So each episode comes with a Masonic paper that we read on the show, as well as a Masonic wallpaper for your mobile device. And I make those each week, and I scan the papers as much as I can so that you actually get these. The app sells for $1.99, and for that you get access to every episode ever, right? So out of 155 episodes, that means you're going to get about 155 papers. You're getting 155 different Masonic wallpapers, and this just keeps on growing as almost a digital archive for yourself as this show continues. Another way, as I mentioned, is through PayPal. So what we do in PayPal is you can click the support the show links on wcypodcast.com, and when you do that, you can click PayPal, and you can send us any amount you choose. So whether it's $1, whether it's $10, that money goes right back into the show, and we use that money to pay for the hosting costs of the show and any of the equipment that we need to bring you the program. Now, the other way I mentioned is through shopping. So we have 2 really cool affiliates. The first is Onnit.com, who makes a flagship product called Alpha Brain, which is kind of like a super version of something like ginkgo biloba, right? But instead, it's actually all natural. There's no caffeine. It's chock full of vitamins, basically vitamins for your brain, and really, really good stuff. They also sell kettlebells and battle ropes. They have the best hemp protein that you can buy. The Hemp Force protein is really good. It's basically great tasting. It's got a high protein count, and it's all vegetarian. So if you're worried about, vegan stuff, I mean, everything they have is no meat, no GMO. Everything's all natural. So if you guys want to do some shopping there, you can click through our links on wcypodcast.com, and you can click when you check out, put in the coupon code WCY. You'll get a percentage off, and they send a little bit back to the show. And another place that you can get a great deal on some truly, truly amazing products is freemasonryart.com. So freemasonryart.com is put together by Brother Juan Sepulveda of the Winding Stairs podcast, and also a co-host on the Masonic Roundtable. Brother Juan is a fine artist, and what that means is he makes a living through art, through his art, and it is fantastic. So if you go to his website, freemasonryart.com, you can get any of his artwork prints. They're all really nice. They go great in your office. Or if you like, he also makes custom-made aprons. These aprons are made of lambskin. They are genuine lambskin. They're white. They're beautiful. They have the rounded corners. He can do them in different trims. There's a black or there's the white. He'll even put custom artwork on the apron. Many other places that offer the custom artwork, actually, they'll draw it out on a computer, hand paint it on one, then they'll scan it, and then they will somehow print that on the lambskin apron. Brother Juan Sepulveda does not do that. He takes the apron you are going to get, and he draws directly on it. You get the original. So it's very different. I believe that is a much superior way to do the business. It's much more personal, and you're having an original piece of artwork that you get to wear to lodge. It is a really good product. So again, freemasonryart.com. You don't have to click through any of my links or anything. You just go to freemasonryart.com, and if you use the promo code WCY, I believe you get a little discount as well. And he will send a little bit back to this show to help keep our lights on also. So on to our second piece. So the next piece I have is another short talk bulletin from March of 1992. It's volume 70, number 3. And this is Masons at the Battle of Gettysburg. This one initially piqued my interest because I do have a general historical keenness for Masonry. I quite enjoyed Halloran's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Freemasonry in the Civil War. So naturally, I really did want to read this one, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. Masons at the Battle of Gettysburg by Sheldon A. Munn. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought in the hot, sticky days of July 1st and 2nd and 3rd, 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had brought his 70,000 soldiers northward for food and supplies to relieve the Virginia from the ravages of war, to influence the power Northern Peace Party to stop the war and to gain Confederate recognition and support from Britain and France. Lee also was looking for an opportunity to defeat the Union Army away from its base in Washington, D.C. 27 months before the Battle of Gettysburg, the first shots of the war between the states were fired between Masons. Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard fired on Union Major Robert Anderson defending Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Beauregard was a Mason and Knight Templar from New Orleans, Louisiana. Anderson was a Mason from Trenton, New Jersey. As the war began with shots fired between Masonic brothers, so did the greatest battle of the war. It was in the morning hours of July 1st, 1863, when Lieutenant Marcellus Jones fired the first shot that began the Battle of Gettysburg. Jones, a carpenter and a Mason from Wheaton, Illinois, used a Sharps 52 caliber breech-loading rifle invented and manufactured by Christian Sharps, a Mason from Philadelphia. The shot that Jones fired was directed at Confederate troops led by Brigadier General Henry Heth, a Mason from Rocky Mountain Lodge in the Utah Territory. In mentioning the Rocky Mountain Lodge, you will find it interesting to know that while it surrendered its charter due to the war, over 200 Masonic lodges were created during the war. An even more unusual circumstance unfolds when we learn that John C. Robinson, a Union Brigadier General and the immediate past master of Rocky Mountain Lodge, was heavily involved in the first days of fighting at Gettysburg. The desperate fighting that day also involved Confederate Major General Henry Heth. Henry Heth had been John Robinson's senior warden in the Rocky Mountain Lodge. Later that morning, Union Brigadier General Solomon Meredith, a Mason from Indiana, and Colonel Lewis Fairchild, a Mason from Wisconsin, met and held the Confederates on the bloodied fields of woods between Hers Ridge and the seminary for over 8 hours. Among those attacking Meredith's legendary Iron Brigade and Fairchild's hard-fighting 2nd Wisconsin Infantry Regiment was Confederate Colonel James Connor, a past master of Landmark Lodge in Charleston, South Carolina. Colonel Henry Moreau of the 24th Michigan was with Meredith's Iron Brigade. During the furious fighting, Moreau was struck in the head by a Confederate bullet. Later, a Confederate surgeon identified himself as a Mason, decided that Moreau's scalp wound was too serious for him to be marched away as a prisoner of war. This act of Masonic compassion probably saved Moreau's life. The very first regimental volley of the battle was fired by the men of the 56th Pennsylvania Volunteers, led by Colonel John W. Hoffman, a Mason from Norristown, PA. Before the first day's battle ended, Hoffman's bloodied regiment would be forced from the fields north of the Chambersburg Road by a gallant charge led by Major William Cox, commander of the 2nd North Carolina Infantry. William Cox was a Mason from Raleigh, North Carolina. He was wounded 11 times during the war and would later become a brigadier general. Cox also became a congressman and served as the Grand Master of North Carolina for 4 years. Early in the evening of the second day's battle on the ridge north of Devil's Den, Union Major General Winfield Hancock told Colonel Edward Cross, quote, "Today you'll earn your star," meaning that Cross would win his promotion to brigadier general for his brilliant service over the past 2 years. Colonel Cross, a Mason from New Hampshire, had received 12 wounds during his heroic service. However, his 13th wound would be fatal, and he was killed leading his brigade against the attacking Confederates led by Brigadier General George Thomas Anderson, a Mason from Atlanta, Georgia. According to Lieutenant General James Longstreet, commander of the Confederate First Corps, the most gallant charge of the entire war was led by Brigadier General William Barksdale, a Mason from Jackson, Mississippi. When Longstreet ordered him forward, Barksdale was on the front line. It was in that position, after forcing the Union lines to collapse and retreat, that he was shot, mortally wounded, wearing a clean white linen shirt fastened with Masonic studs. Barksdale's courageous charge was directed at the bloody peach orchard, defended in part by the men of the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, led by Captain Thomas Hubbard, a Mason from Concord, New Hampshire. Hubbard was killed on the battlefield and was buried by Confederate Masons. Consider the significance of this act when soldiers in the midst of a major battle take the time to care and to bury an enemy soldier. Unusual in every sense of the word, but not so unusual when you consider that it happened between Masons. While the entire southern end of the battlefield erupted with savage fighting at the peach orchard, the wheat field and Devil's Den, a hero was born on the rocky wooded southern slope of Little Round Top. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, formerly a language professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, was in command of the 20th Maine Infantry defending the critical Union left flank. The determined Confederates launched attack after attack against Chamberlain's shattered line. The gallant defenders held their position heroically despite their fearful losses. Running out of ammunition and without reinforcement, Chamberlain knew that the next Confederate attack would destroy his line and cause the loss of the Federal Army's strong defensive position. It was then that Chamberlain, a man schooled in religion and language, ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge the attacking Confederates in a swinging barn door-like maneuver. His unorthodox attack shocked the rebels, causing them to scatter in hurried retreat. Chamberlain was a Mason, a member of the United Lodge in Brunswick, Maine. He would receive a Congressional Medal of Honor in recognition of his courage and heroism at Gettysburg. While Chamberlain was gallantly defending the southern end of the Union's fishhook-shaped line, another Mason was desperately trying to overrun the Union Army on the opposite end of that line on Culp's Hill. John Brown Gordon, a successful businessman and lawyer from Georgia, had fought with brilliance. Throughout the 2 years prior to Gettysburg, Gordon had been severely wounded 9 months earlier at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862. A bullet hole in his hat had saved him from drowning in his own blood as they lay unconscious on the battlefield. Gordon was a man of extraordinary compassion and care, a trait taught at our fraternity's holy altars. During Gordon's attack on the first day, which resulted in the Confederates forcing the Union Army to retreat from their position in the fields north of Gettysburg, Union Brigadier General Francis Barlow was severely wounded. A Confederate bullet paralyzed his arms and legs. When Gordon, in the midst of his attack, saw Barlow, he dismounted, gave Barlow water from his canteen, and saw that he was cared for. Another instance where Mason's compassion and care for his brother transcended the hostility normally found between enemies. The Battle of Gettysburg was culminated in an attack, the likes of which the world had never seen, nor would ever see again. It was on the afternoon of July 3rd, following a 2-hour cannonade of volcanic proportions, that 3 Confederate generals, all Virginia Masons, led the attack that had become known as Pickett's Charge, correctly named Longstreet's Assault. Major General George Pickett, Brigadier General James Kemper, and Brigadier General Lewis Armistead led their 12,000 men across the mile-long rolling fields to crash against the center of the Union line near the clump of trees that became the high-water mark of the Confederacy. As the Confederate tide swept closer to the Union line, a sergeant in the 14th Virginia Infantry came upon some Union skirmishers huddled in a tall wheat who had been cut off from their retreat. The Virginians would have been fully justified in killing the Union soldiers. They were the enemy. But the sergeant recognized the Masonic sign, the sign of distress thrown by one of the Yankees, and ordered his men to pass them by. Wasn't it fortunate that the Virginia Sergeant Drury B. Easley was a Mason, a member of South Boston Lodge in Halifax County, Virginia? Brigadier General Lewis Armistead was the only officer to pierce the Union line. As Armistead crossed the low stone on the wall formed at the front of the Union defense line, he shouted, "Give 'em the cold steel, boys," holding his black hat on the tip of his sword to guide his men, since all his color-bearers had been killed. He led his 150 Virginians amidst the swirling tide of blue coats. Placing his hand on the hot smoking Union cannon barrel, he claimed it his in the name of the Old Dominion. Instantly, he was struck by 2 bullets and fell, giving the sign of distress. At the same time, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, the general commanding the Union troops defending the line at the center of the Confederate attack, saw his old friend and Masonic brother fall. Hancock, a member of Charity Lodge in Norristown, PA, who was severely wounded at the time, ordered his chief of staff, Captain Henry Harrison Bingham, a Mason from Philadelphia, to go to Armistead's aid. Bingham had Armistead taken to the 11th Corps Field Hospital, where he received the best medical care possible. When Armistead died, Hancock saw that his personal belongings were handled according to his wishes. The Armistead-Hancock story is most unusual, especially when you consider that they were in fact enemies. But it is not unusual when you consider that they were Masons. Again, we witness the power of brotherly love, care, and concern, transcending the most severe hatred and hostility associated with battle. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought between 70,000 Confederates and 93,000 Union soldiers. Over 50,000 men became casualties in those 3 terrible days. The Confederate Army would retreat back into Virginia, and the war would continue for another 18 months. The war began with shots fired between Masonic brothers. The greatest battle of that war was started with the shots fired between Masonic brothers. How do you suppose the war ended? Come with me to that chill, damp Easter Sunday morning on April 9th, 1865. In Appomattox, Virginia, when over 112,000 well-fed and well-equipped Federal soldiers surrounded the 26,765 starving, ragged Confederates, all that remained of the once invincible army of Northern Virginia. It was a time for the Yankees to shout and cheer. It was time to celebrate. It was the end of the war, the bloodiest in American casualties that the world had ever seen or would see again. 618,000 men became casualties, but the killing years were finally over. No one would have disputed the Yankees' right to scream, shout, and cheer. But when Confederate General John Gordon brought his battle-hardened Stonewall Brigade on the field to lay down their guns and furl their tattered flags, Union General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ordered his men to give their former enemies a full military salute. It was an honorable and heartfelt act. It was the first act to heal the wounds of a nation, and that greeting was given by a Mason. It was an act that uplifted the spirits of every man present. But then, what would you have expected? Remember that both Joshua Chamberlain and John Gordon were Masons, representing a brotherhood that was never divided, now dedicated to a nation indivisible. So there you have it, the legend of a couple of Masonic brothers in the Confederate Army and the Union Army, where they met in battle. That particular story has been disproved through empirical research, but there are many other fascinating tales about Masonry in the Civil War. If you do want to go ahead and read Michael Halloran's The Better Angels of Our Nature, Freemasonry in the Civil War, that is a fantastic book. And within the first 2 chapters, he debunks quite a bit of the stories that you may have grown to love as myths, but I assure you, when you keep reading, you will find even more incredible things that did happen. So check that book out. This week's famous Freemason is Cecil Rhodes. So if you don't know who Cecil Rhodes is, his full name is Cecil John Rhodes, and he was a British businessman really into mining and politics in South Africa. Rhodes was named the chairman of the De Beers Diamond Company, which was founded in 1888. De Beers established with the funding from N.M. Rothschilds & Sons Limited in 1887. Today markets 40% of the world's rough diamonds, and at one time marketed 90%. He was an ardent believer in the British colonialism. Rhodes was the founder of the Southern African territory of Rhodesia, which was named after him in 1895. South Africa's Rhodes University is also named after Rhodes, and he set up provisions of the Rhodes Scholarship, which is funded by his estate. Historian Richard A. McFarlane has called Rhodes, quote, as integral a participant in Southern Africa and British imperial history as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln are in their respective eras in the United States history. Most histories of South Africa covering the last decades of the 19th century are contributions to the historiography of Cecil Rhodes. While attending Oriel College, Rhodes became a Freemason in the Apollo University Lodge. Although initially he did not approve of the organization, he continued to be a Freemason until his death in 1902. The shortcomings of the Freemasons, in his opinion, later caused him to envisage his own secret society with the goal of bringing the entire world under British rule. That's it for this week. Please remember to find us on Facebook and follow on Twitter at Whence. You can check us out on Google Plus at the email address wcypodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you have any questions or comments about the show, I'd be happy to entertain those if you want to go ahead and send those on to wcypodcast@gmail.com also. Please remember to check out the Masonic Roundtable, which is a live show hosted by Brother Jason Richards, Brother John Ruark, Brother Nick Johnson, and Brother Juan Sepulveda, and of course myself. We go live on Tuesday nights at 10/9 Central, so check that out, the MasonicRoundtable.com. Another great website is, of course, the MidnightFreemasons.org. That's .org. We publish 3 great articles every single week, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Thought-provoking pieces, pieces that make you feel, pieces that are intellectual, just really good stuff. We have a great team of writers, and I'd invite you all to check those out. If you're interested in contributing to the Midnight Freemasons, send me an email. So last but not least, I'd like you to check out the neckties from fraternalties.com. He has a couple 32nd degree masonry ties left. At the time you're listening to this, he may be sold out, but if you go to the website and you click on the link to subscribe to his email list, that is your best shot at getting one of these ties, because what he does is he will send out an email that says, hey, you need to sign on to fraternalties.com on this day at this hour, use this password to get into the website, and you can buy a tie. That's kind of how he does it. I get a lot of guys who ask me, how do you get these ties? Well, that's how. You have to join that email list and you'll get a really good shot at it. Otherwise, you're going to need to follow everything on Facebook because that's where he does most of his business. It's 2014. Social media is the way to do business for a lot of people, and that is one of the best mediums for Brother John Paul Gomez, the artist and crafter behind Fraternal Ties. So check that out, fraternalties.com. And I also want to give a shout out to my friend, co-host, brother, and all-around great guy, Brother Jason Richards, for being invited into the Allied Masonic Degrees, the AMD. So Jason, it's well-deserved, and I know I speak for everyone when I say congratulations. I'll talk to you all next week. Stay on the level for Whence Came You. I'm Robert Johnson.